Hello, everyone. My name is Jae Kwon, a PhD student working with Professor Frank Park at Seoul National University. And I'm happy to share our joint research with Naval Labs on kinodynamic model identification. While this is a very old topic, we generalize the traditional identification framework for better robustness to measurement noises. So what is model identification? When we control a robot or build a simulator, we always have to identify models of the robot first. As is well known, there are two basic models to be identified, kinematics and dynamics. To explain easily with clear concepts, here we just assume that our kinematic model computes the end effector poses for given joint angles, and our dynamic model computes the joint torques for given joint states. Before we start, I'm going to introduce some notations mainly used in this video. For the kinematics, A and T denote joint twist and the end effector pose respectively, and psi is the kinematic error. And for the dynamics, phi and tau denote link inertia parameters and joint torque respectively, and var theta or curly theta is the dynamic error. D with the subscripts psi and var theta denote the distance matrix for the pose and torque respectively. Then the model identification is basically to find the optimal model parameters that minimize the error between the model estimates and its actual sensor measurements. For instance, the kinematic model identification is to find the best parameter of joint twist and the end effector pose at zero configuration or home position that minimize the estimation error of the end effector poses. Similarly, the dynamic model identification is to find the optimal mass inertia parameter denoted by phi here that minimizes the joint torque errors. However, the dynamics depends on not only the inertia parameter, but also the kinematic parameters, and we need to know the kinematic parameters before the dynamic model identification. Thus, in traditional frameworks, the kinematic identification is executed first, and then the dynamic identification is executed next, using that pre-identified kinematic parameter. If the kinematic parameters are not accurate enough, then the dynamic identification cannot be accurate as well, even when there's no measurement noise for joint torque. For example, look at this simple 2DOF manipulator. We have to identify the link length L1 and L2, which are the kinematic parameters of this system, and identify the mass of the point mass M1 and M2, which are the dynamic parameters. From the Euler-Lagrange equation, we can easily derive the joint torques, denoted by tau, which can be decomposed into a known regressor matrix gamma and an unknown vector P, which is the lumped vector of the model parameters. This P vector is again decomposed into two terms. One is lambda, the kinematic term given by L1 and L2, and another term is phi, a concatenated vector of M1 and M2. Following the traditional decoupled identification method, the kinematic parameters L1 and L2 are identified by measuring the end effector positions for each joint angle. And then we identify the mass M1 and M2 with the equation of motion. However, if we assume that our estimates L1 prime and L2 prime are not equal to the true values due to noisy position measurements, then the problem is that we can never find the proper values of M1 and M2 that satisfy the equation of motion because of these two different lambda terms. This problem is called uncorrectable model bias. To address the model bias problem, we propose a unified identification framework. As seen in this diagram, while the traditional methods are conducting those two identifications sequentially in the decoupled manner, our method simply unifies those two optimization problems into a single problem. In the traditional methods, it is essential to use highly accurate but very expensive vision sensors, or CAD parameters, provided by manufacturers to prevent the kinematic error propagating to the following dynamic identification. But our method is able to identify the dynamics with just a cheap USB web camera as accurately as an expensive motion capture system. Even in the future, when personal robots become more affordable to everyone, it will be still unlikely that every house has its own motion capture system, which costs more than $50,000. So we believe that our unified identification can be a practical solution that allows people to calibrate their robots with more accessible sensors. The unification is surprisingly straightforward. We just add the kinematic error and the dynamic error together with a trade-off weight alpha. And the optimization variables are the kinematic parameter A and the dynamic parameter phi. As before, for simplicity, we just let A be the joint twist and tau be the mass inertia parameters. But these could be any other measurements depending on different types of robots and sensors. Then we can now use the dynamic error to adjust the kinematic parameters properly, which is not possible in the decoupled methods. Because alpha indicates the weight for the kinematic error, the dynamic error becomes less important, and the kinematic error becomes more dominant as alpha increases, and vice versa. It is well described by this conceptual picture. While the blue line represents the level curves of the dynamic error, the green gradation represents the kinematic error. The greener indicates the smaller kinematic error. The weight alpha smoothly adjusts the equilibrium point between those two error gradients. As an extreme case, this unified ID problem becomes the traditional decoupled method when alpha goes to infinity, which means that only the kinematic error is used to identify the kinematic parameter, regardless of the dynamic error. In the other extreme, when alpha goes to 0, then it becomes another dynamic identification problem, where the kinematic parameters are identified without any vision sensor, but only the force sensors. We found it similar to some learning-based methods training a neural network, where the input is the joint states and the output is the joint torque. Instead of the neural network, our method is just using the physics-based rigid body dynamics. Such linearly weighted criteria tend to introduce a level of ad hoc arbitrariness in the choice of weight. So based on a maximal likelihood estimation argument, we established that the weight is a measure of the relative accuracies between the kinematic measurement and the dynamic measurement. Specifically, we assume that the noisy measurements are sampled from Gaussian-like distributions. That is, the probability is proportional to the exponential of the quadratic error divided by sigma, the scale of the noise. So you may recognize that the sigma corresponds to the covariance of a Gaussian distribution. Then the probability of the entire data set is given by the product of the probabilities of all samples. And taking minus log operation at both sides, we get the negative log likelihood of the dataset, which has exactly the same form as the unified kinodynamic error, except for the constant C. To summarize, following this probabilistic interpretation, alpha increases as the kinematic sensor noise decreases, which means the kinematic sensor becoming more accurate. This is reasonable because if the kinematic sensor is very accurate, so sigma t becomes very small, then we should definitely increase the weight alpha so that we can learn more from the kinematic error than the dynamic error. On the other hand, if the kinematic sensor is very noisy and sigma t becomes very large, then we have to decrease alpha to complement the lack of kinematic information by exploiting more the dynamic error. To solve this problem based on gradient-based optimization, we need 4 derivatives. That is, the derivatives of the kinematic error with respect to both kinematic and dynamic parameters, and the derivatives of the dynamics error with respect to kinematic and dynamic parameters. From the traditional methods, we already have the decoupled ones, the kinematic error gradient with respect to the kinematic parameters and the dynamic error gradient with respect to the dynamic parameters. However, what we don't have yet is the dynamic error gradient with respect to the kinematic parameters. Note that the other one, the kinematic error gradient with respect to the dynamic parameters is 0 because the kinematics is independent of the dynamic parameters. Traditionally, the differential dynamics with respect to the joint states, the joint angle, velocity, and acceleration has been widely used for many applications such as motion optimization and model identification. Differentiating the recursive dynamics, the derivatives of the link body velocity v and the body acceleration v dot and force range f can be obtained recursively. However, to solve the unified identification problem, we need the derivatives with respect to the joint twist A that has never been presented by the previous works. In this work, we newly propose the differential dynamics with respect to the joint twist. Those colored PQR denotes the derivative matrices of v, v dot, and f, respectively. And the subscript I denotes the link number. Then, after doing some calculation, we get these recursive equations of PQR. Note that because vi depends on vi minus 1, So Pi also depends on Pi minus 1. Including the other equations for Q and R, the recursive relationships are the same as the original recursive dynamics. Please refer to the paper for technical details. You may wonder why the joint twists are denoted by eta instead of A in the previous slides. Because the joint twists have joint constraints, we reparameterize it by adjoint representation, which is firstly introduced by Chang Li et al. In 2016. Since the large adjoint operation preserves the joint constraints for any eta vector, we can now remove the joint constraints and solve the identification problem as unconstrained optimization. In our experiments, a numerical study with Kukaiwa and a hardware experiment with robot Ambidex developed by Naver Labs and Koreatech are conducted. In both experiments, we compare the kinematic and dynamic errors for different values of alpha. In the numerical study, the synthetic noises are added to both end-effector pose measurements and the joint torque measurements. As expected, we could observe that the trade-off in the overall trend. The torque error increases while the pose error decreases as alpha increases. However, these plots are the estimation errors in the test set, which is not overlapped with the training set and not used for identification. So the trade-off is not monotonic in these test errors. And while alpha decreases from 10 to the 8 to 10 to the 2, both kinematic and dynamic errors are decreased at the same time. As mentioned earlier, when alpha is very large, it gets close to the traditional decoupled identification. So with proper value of alpha, our unified method shows better accuracy in those errors than the traditional method because the maximum likelihood estimation is more robust to the measurement noises. The most right figure shows the joint twist error, 2 norm of the difference between the identified twist and the ground truth. Although lower twist error does not necessarily indicate lower pose error in theory, we could directly observe that the joint twists are also identified the most accurately when alpha equals to 10 to the 2. Next, the hardware experiment with Ambidex. We compare the results of using 2 cameras that each have high accuracy and low accuracy, denoted by high and low respectively. The high accuracy camera is the motion capture system, and the low accuracy camera is the USB web camera. The April tags are attached to the end effector to measure the pose with the webcam. The blue circle named CAD denotes that the kinematic parameters are given by CAD design instead of the kinematic identification. We could observe that the same trade-offs as seen before, and it is very interesting that when alpha decreases from infinity to 1, to compare our unified method with the traditional method, the dynamic error is significantly reduced while the kinematic errors are almost constant. And even the webcam could achieve the same dynamic error as the CAD one. More surprisingly, the yellow marker named none denotes the other extreme, where no camera is used, and all kinodynamic model parameters are identified with only the torque error. Thus, it shows almost the lowest torque error, as expected, but as you can see in the fourth subfigure at the top, the joint twists are very different from the ground truth. This means that the joint twists are not fully identifiable from the joint torques. In other words, there exists a null space of the joint twists that do not affect the dynamics. As a following work, we have some preliminary results on co-optimization of design and motion. And it is interesting to study more on identifiability of the joint twist from the joint torque and to derive the Hessian, the second derivative of the joint torque with respect to the joint twist. In summary, we address the model bias problem that frequently occurs when using low accuracy vision sensors. To address the problem, we propose a novel framework of unified kinodynamic identification, of which one extreme case is the traditional identification. For computational efficiency, the differential dynamics with respect to the joint twist is introduced for the analytic gradients. Thank you for listening, and please give any question to my email.